The subject of today's hearing is the fiscal year 2025 budget for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, or phonetically, CISA. Thank you for doing that phonetically for me, staff. I would like to thank you, Director Easterly, for being here, and I now recognize our ranking member from Texas for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Director. As you know, our adversary continue to leverage cyber tactics to threaten our national security, our economy, and our way of life. It's hard to find a day where we're learning of a new attack on the school system, critical infrastructure, our healthcare data, or a federal agency, which is, again, something that's very important to the work that you do. These threats are posed by individual bad actors, transnational criminal organizations, foreign adversaries like state-sponsored groups, and nations. While their capabilities are increasingly more advanced, we also continue to learn basic cyber hygiene issues such as improper password management protocols, challenges while securing outdated systems and equipment. The FY25 budget proposal for CISA is just over $3 billion, which is about $136 million above the FY24 enacted, while it includes several important investments such as the $470 million for continuous diagnosis and mitigation program and $394 million for the JCE, Joint Cooperative Environment. I'm concerned about whether we're doing enough given the resources advantages of those that are wishing to cause problems to our cyber security systems and our critical infra system. As you know, our adversaries are not limited by what Congress is willing to fund them. They find the money one way or the other, and they're required to play by the same rules as our agencies are. Disappointed by the cuts that we had to make to CISA's budget in the 2024 bill. But again, many people don't know, but CISA's budget is primarily funded by the so-called defense dollars. For us on this committee, that means we can't simply reduce funding elsewhere while our bill increases funding for CISA. So again, we need to work on the funding part of it. We know that the PRC is not our only threat. Our nation's cyber frontier and critical infrastructure are far too vulnerable to attack, and we must do more to make sure that we outpace our adversaries. So again, you all play a very unique and vital role in partnering with our federal agencies, state and local governments, the private sector, and the critical infrastructure owners and operators to make sure that we protect them against emerging and evolving threats. So again, we want to hear about the challenges and the opportunities that their agency is looking at to ensure our security and operational vitality of our federal networks and our nation's critical infrastructure. Again, I want to say thank you so much for the work that you and your men and women are doing. We hope we can also hear one more thing before I close about the state and local cybersecurity grant program and what you expect to come from that funding. So again, thank you for all the work that you do and look forward to asking you a few questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Director Easterly, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Amadei, Ranking Member Cuellar, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify on CISA's budget. As America's Cyber Defense Agency and the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience, CISA leads the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to our cyber and physical infrastructure. And I'm particularly excited to be talking to you today, given this morning's release of National Security Memorandum 22, which reinforces CISA's role of managing cross-sector risk to the cyber infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. The FY25 President's budget requests $3 billion for CISA, $136 million more than what you appropriated in FY24. It's critically important to continue the strong and steady investment Congress has made in CISA's mission to protect the nation from increasingly complex threats. While our mission is broad and diverse, I'm going to briefly highlight just 3 areas that encompass the increases that we're requesting. And in response to your specific direction from last year, I'm going to point out how we've linked outcomes to appropriations, specifically how we're using the budget to materially drive down risk in communities across the nation. First key area, federal cybersecurity. As the operational lead for the .gov, we leveraged some $600 million to defend these .gov networks as a single enterprise, protecting America's sensitive data and federal agencies. And through Congress's support, we've been able to detect and respond faster than ever before. One, using that CDM program that the ranking member mentioned, we've been able to remediate over 25 million unpatched vulnerabilities and reduce the number of vulnerabilities that have been exposed for 45 days or more by 72%. Two, we've deployed endpoint detection and response tools to over 50 agencies covering 900,000 devices, deployed detections that allowed us to find over 1,900 threats so that we could mitigate risk to .gov networks. And three, our shared services deployed to 100 federal agencies are saving taxpayer dollars. Our protective domain name solution service, for example, has blocked more than 692 million malicious connections since the start of this fiscal year. Second key area of investment is we look at the threats to our nation. None is more serious than Chinese cyber actors that are burrowing deep into our critical infrastructure to prepare to launch disruptive and destructive attacks in the event of a major conflict. Now, we're doing a lot on this, to your point. We can do more, but let me tell you what we're doing now with our budget. First, we've deployed threat hunting teams across multiple sectors, water, power, energy, and transportation to find and eradicate these Chinese cyber actors. And we've shared insights with others before they become victims. Now, these PRC hunting missions are just part of our larger hunting missions. In just FY23, we conducted 97 hunt engagements to eradicate threat actors from U.S. critical infrastructure, and we shared over 1,100 cyber advisories to enable risk reduction at scale. Two, we use our Cyber Sentry platform that is best-in-class detection to enable us to drive down risk to the most important critical infrastructure, talking pipelines, energy generation, large airports, critical manufacturing. We have 30 companies with 15 more joining. Three, our Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, now with 320 private sector companies, has an active planning effort with key industry partners to mitigate risk from Chinese targeting as part of a broader risk reduction effort, which has produced 93 joint cyber alerts and 14 cyber defense plans. Finally, third key area of investment. While nearly all critical infrastructure sectors are priority targets for nation-state actors and cyber criminals, many do not have the resources to protect themselves. So based on the budget you've given us, we've stood in to support them. Specifically, we've grown our field presence across the nation by 35%, quadrupling the engagements that we have across the country, fourfold from 22 to 23. We've leveraged our pre-ransomware notification initiative to do 1,900 such notifications, schools, water facilities, hospitals, to prevent organizations from suffering from ransomware. We've also used our vulnerability warning pilot, 2,000 notifications to organizations, driving mitigation of over 3 million vulnerabilities across 7,600 organizations since 2022. And of note, our ability to proactively warn businesses will only increase when we implement cyber incident reporting. And in FY25, that will be the year that we need to ensure we have the infrastructure in place to analyze and report in accordance with the law. Finally, I want to sincerely thank this committee for all of your support and for helping to strengthen CISA and, by extension, the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Ranking Member, Mr. Cuellar, the floor is yours for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk about the PRC threats. Again, Director Ray's recent testimony and public comments about the PRC capabilities and intentions, as you mentioned, are quite alarming. We're also aware of the Chinese Communist Party interest in Taiwan, and of course, importantly, to make sure that we look at how they want to prevent us from getting involved. From CISA's perspective, and recognize some of this might be classified, so let's talk about only what you can talk about. Can you talk about those threats and capabilities you see coming from China, and how those intentions threaten us here, specifically in the U.S.? You mentioned some of those things, but could you add any further examples?
Absolutely, Ranking Member. We've long been focused on cyber threats. Typically, it's been about data theft, intellectual property theft, espionage, And over the past year, we have seen this evolution for pre-positioning into critical infrastructure, specifically for disruption and destruction. That is the real difference here. And this is not an intel assessment. This is a threat that we have actually found through our hunting teams. We have eradicated and evicted these Chinese cyber actors in multiple sectors, as I mentioned, water, power, energy, transportation. But we believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so we are working with critical infrastructure owners and operators across the country to make sure that they understand this threat, that they can identify and detect this threat in their network, and that they can put in place mitigations that can allow them to reduce the risk of potential mass disruption. A couple things, if I can take the time, it's really important for any constituents of yours. We need to make sure that if there is a cyber incident, that they are reporting it into CISA. We actually just launched an easy-to-remember 1-844-SAY-CISA for anybody who wants to report an incident. Also, we think it's very important that anybody across America establishes a relationship with their CISA field force. We're very proud of how we've grown that capability. And to ensure that they are taking advantage of our vulnerability scanning, our cyber performance goals, and improving their resilience. This is the most serious threat to our nation that I have seen in more than 30 years in the U.S. government, and it's absolutely critical that our critical infrastructure owners and operators, businesses, small and large, take it seriously, and CISA is ready to stand in and help.
With the current resource limitations, I'm very concerned about your agency's capacity to defend against the threats that you just mentioned, especially when you said it's only the tip of an iceberg. What additional resources do you need to be successful in these efforts beyond what's in the budget request?
Well, we, of course, support the president's budget, ranking member.
That's the standard line.
Yes, sir. Yes,
But
sir. Of course, we can do more with more. As you recall, we talked about this earlier. And very helpfully, there was a layout of about $150 million more that would allow us to do three things. The first one would be to continue to build on that cyber sentry capability, which is really best in class and can be deployed at the most important critical infrastructure owners so that we can detect and prevent significant damage to the infrastructure that we believe Chinese cyber actors are going after. So that's one category. Two, to increase our capacity to be able to hunt. So our hunt teams, as I mentioned, 97 engagements on domestic infrastructure in FY23, but we can do more with more. And then finally, to continue to grow our field force. I'm very proud that since 2021, we've grown by almost 1,700 people. And a lot of that is in the field, but we need to continue to grow our cybersecurity advisors, our physical security advisors, to enable us to help the small and medium businesses, the critical infrastructure owners and operators that are under duress from these very serious nation-state threats.
as a sportsman, I appreciate you using the word as hunters to find those threats because, again, some of them, like you mentioned, are deep somewhere else, and it's so. Thank you. Finally, my last question: how big of a role do you see mis and disinformation campaigns playing in the PRC's overall strategy?
So we know, based on the intelligence community's annual threat assessment, that foreign actors are increasingly interested in going after the U.S. in a variety of ways, in particular in our elections for interference, for influence, for manipulation. It's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, and this is a real concern of the state and local election officials that we work with. What we are doing to be helpful is we are providing information about tactics that our foreign adversaries use to try and influence elections so that election officials understand these tactics and what they can do. We're updating our Rumor versus Reality website to provide accurate information about election infrastructure security. Most importantly, though, we are amplifying the voices of trusted election officials across the country to ensure that citizens know who to go to if they have any questions about election security or about voting matters so that they can go to those election officials. And so that's how we're supporting them to deal with foreign malign influence operations from China and other adversaries.
Thank you. Well, we certainly want to be supportive.
Thank you, sir.
Director, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director, for being here. It's great to see you again.
You
And
too, Sheriff.
I want to talk a little bit about what you do locally for folks, because I think that's important to get out, understanding that, you know, everyone's familiar with the hacks at government facilities and those kind of things. But fact of the matter is, a lot of the infrastructure that's being attacked, as everyone knows, is really more privately held. Pipelines like Colonial and JBS Meats and, you know, some of these other facilities, but our hospitals and all of these other locations. And now one that I had never thought about is our vehicles. Our vehicles are actually collecting data as they're driving down the street. In fact, China now becoming the largest vehicle exporter, including into the United States. Are we working with those importers of cars to make sure that we're not bringing in, you know, a Trojan horse, so to speak, that could endanger some of our infrastructure?
So in the National Security Memorandum that was published this morning, it really reinforces CISA's role in this cross-sector risk management because, as you point out, Sheriff, this infrastructure, everything we rely upon is digitized, and everything has these very complicated supply chains. So we need to work across all sectors, including technology sectors, to ensure we can drive down that risk, particularly the risk of foreign intrusions into our networks. With respect to the auto industry in particular, we're doing three things. We're working with a variety of auto manufacturers to ensure that they know how to leverage CISA's capabilities to do vulnerability disclosure. That's very important. We're also working on potential risks from electric vehicles, like malware being in certain parts of that supply chain, just as you pointed out. And then we're, of course, working with the auto ISAC. And they put out a lot of good information. We're sharing information from them. We're part of their conferences on best practices. And so we're continuing to evolve that capability, sir.
You know, the Chinese are now requiring in China that all of the information collected by their vehicles, whether they're from America or internally, that all of that data has to be locally stored, captured and locally stored. Do we have anything like that in America?
No, sir.
Okay.
It's part of
think we should.
the part of the well, it's
You
part
know,
of the
I asked
challenge.
Secretary Buttigieg about this morning,
Yeah.
and I know we've reached out to DOD and Department of Commerce about these issues as well, but I was just curious, you know, if your agency has any intent to look at that as a requirement,
Yeah.
possibly by some of these people. Maybe that's better for the Department of Commerce. I don't know.
Yes, sir. I'm happy to follow up on that. You know, everything that we do, we focus very much on preserving privacy of data. That's certainly not the way our adversaries look at it, unfortunately, and it's why we're concerned about capabilities like TikTok, as you're well aware.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll tell you another area that I think you guys are doing just incredible work is in school safety. And I know y'all have come down to my district actually and helped in this regard, which I really appreciate. And I think the public needs to know that CISA is taking that kind of a hands-on approach at a very local level to work with small businesses, work with our schools. And in fact, the schoolsafety.gov site that you have up, which is really a kind of a repository for all these great ideas. What is some of the feedback that you're getting? I know some schools, the more rural schools, they have difficulty with implementation. they may have a great plan, they may get a great plan from you, but they don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, Sheriff, thank you for raising that. It's one of the things that people don't realize that CISA does, but it's so important. And, you know, I was down at, when we set up schoolsafety.gov, it was after the tragedy at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and I was just down there to visit the school. So it's been around for 6 years, but we have that schoolsafety.gov, which is basically a clearinghouse for so much information, physical security, cybersecurity, to help protect both teachers and students. And we have been engaging with hundreds of communities across the country to ensure that they're aware of all of these no-cost resources, to include, really helpfully, a grant finder tool. So they know how they can take advantage of these grants that are sometimes difficult to navigate if you're a less resourced entity across the country. We just had our second annual School Safety Summit. 8,000 people sharing ideas. We're using the funding that we have for school safety to enable us to build the clearinghouse, add on additional guidance, and make sure that we can keep our kids and our educators safe across the nation.
Thank you very much. I see my time is up. I will tell you, though, I have a bill coming forward. It's Plan for School Safety Act, which will actually help set up school safety development centers where give you kind of a common point of contact with some localities. So
Fantastic.
thank you very much for all you're doing.
Thanks, Sheriff.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Director Easterly. It's good to see you. Over the last few years, I've been grateful for your partnership as we've worked to improve and expand the role of the Protective Security Advisors, or PSAs, at CISA. In addition to serving as local experts on critical infrastructure protection and helping our communities respond to threats, the PSAs can help expand access to federal resources by conducting security assessments that are required to apply for the nonprofit security grant funding from DHS. And since this funding is one of the best ways for schools and places of worship and other community centers to get federal funding for their physical security at a time when Islamophobic and anti-Semitic threats are on the rise, PSAs are more important than ever. Director Easterly, can you share an update on CISA's work to expand and improve the availability of PSAs to communities like mine? And how would this year's budget request be used to support this work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Congresswoman. And I know my team in your district loves working with you and your team. So it's one of those things that people don't necessarily think about when you think about CISA, but we have an amazing cadre of protective security advisors who've been around for a long time, who come from the community, who work with the community. And so we're excited to be able to continue to grow and strengthen. As I mentioned, we've grown our field force by 35%. We've been able to quadruple the number of engagements. And so working in districts to be able to reduce risk, and this is across the board. Physical security, for example, you mentioned some of the Islamophobia. We worked very closely with faith-based institutions. We gave them checklists around physical security. We created specifically physical security protective guidelines for faith-based institutions, and our folks went around the country so we could actually work in districts with constituents to help them drive down risk. So I really appreciate you highlighting that capability.
Thank you. Shout out to Region 5's PSAs. They do a great job. Please let us know if you need additional resources to support their great work. Now I want to turn to the growing digital threats posed by foreign governments like the People's Republic of China. It's no secret that TikTok, whose parent company ByteDance is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, poses unique risks to Americans, and the president signed legislation this week to take action. This legislation passed the Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, but it's clear that the public wants and needs to hear more. What more can you tell us in this setting about the types of data on American consumers that TikTok collects, and how that information can be used and manipulated, and how do ByteDance's activities here differ from other major social media and technology companies?
Yeah. So I think it's really important just to fundamentally recognize that the way that China looks at data is fundamentally different than the way we look at data. So when you talk about US-based social media companies, that data that is collected through apps like TikTok is available to the Chinese government to be able to use it for whatever purposes that they want. And that's the real worry, given the amount of data that's being collected on users here within the US, and in particular, children. So how that data can be used, there are no restrictions from the point of view of the Chinese government. And as we talked about earlier, this is a government that is already burrowing deep into our U.S. domestic civilian critical infrastructure with the intent to launch disruption and destruction, to incite societal panic and chaos and deter our ability to marshal military might and citizen will in the event of a crisis in Taiwan. So we can't just separate the TikTok and ByteDance of China from the China that we know is going after civilian infrastructure. We have to look at this threat as very connected.
Thank you. I encourage you and your partners in the administration to do more to publicize these unique and real threats, including declassification where appropriate. Our constituents work, learn, and build community online, and when major digital platforms can be co-opted by a foreign adversary, they should know what that looks like. Our country's critical infrastructure is at risk from the PRC, as you've raised, and countering that threat has been a major focus of this committee's work over the last year. In December, I wrote to you urging additional investment from CISA to help identify, to prevent, and respond to devastating cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure. Can you expand on how this budget request will help you increase CISA's cybersecurity defense capabilities to counter PRC threats?
Yes, ma'am. As I mentioned, we asked for $136 million more. It is largely into the cybersecurity areas. So areas where we know that Chinese actors go after federal.gov. We saw major intrusions into cloud last summer. We just issued the Cyber Safety Review Board about the security of the cloud. So that's one key area. The area around Volt Typhoon, critical infrastructure, that's where we need cyber sentry capabilities, hunting capabilities. And then additionally, the other big area is the ability to deploy more advisors who are doing those notifications in every district around the U.S. about intrusions into critical infrastructure. So with more, we can do more, and I'm very grateful for the letter you sent to OMB Director Young. And it's hugely important that we have the resources we need to defend the nation.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Henson, is recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cuellar. Thank you, Director Easterly, for coming before us. It's great to work with you and great to see you again. And I want to actually follow up on some things my colleague, Ms. Underwood, was just talking about. You know, when you came before the China Select Committee recently, you detailed some of the very, very heightened threats that we are facing. And I know we had a chance to talk about this. You said new threats are being uncovered every single day. We know that China and our other adversaries are continually trying to infiltrate our critical infrastructure. And really, it is about sowing that chaos, right, and creating that dysfunction. So we need to be proactive in our efforts to counter those malicious attacks from China and our other bad actors. So I appreciate your efforts to specifically take on Volt Typhoon. We know what a devastating attack that has been. You mentioned in your opening statement some of the capabilities, specifically the three that you are leveraging to really go after these threats: attack surface managerial service, the Cyber Sentry platform, and critical infrastructure shared services pilot. So can you maybe detail a little bit more specifically on the attack surface management service, how that is really helping enhance security and resilience across the board for critical infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. It's one of the most important new services that we've put into play over the last couple of years. And just to break it down when we talk about attack surface management. So at the end of the day, the critical infrastructure that we rely upon is inherently vulnerable. So you have glitches in code, you have openings and flaws and defects in the technology base that allows threat actors to go in there and deploy malware or to get in and steal credentials so they can take over a network. So what our capabilities do are they scan for these defects, these vulnerabilities that are exposed, in particular, if we know those vulnerabilities are being used by nation-state actors or cyber criminals. And when we can see those open vulnerabilities, we then notify that organization, you have an exposed or unpatched vulnerability, and this is what you need to do immediately to get it patched. As I mentioned,
Does it usually take someone having an experience that's bad for you to realize that there's a vulnerability there, or do you have AI? I mean, what are you using to determine those vulnerabilities?
we use various commercial capabilities to scan for those open vulnerabilities. Typically, we try to get to them before harm occurs. That's how we're using our pre-ransomware notification initiative. We've done that 2,054 times since we launched that program, and we are preventing organizations from getting attacked by ransomware. And I've seen a lot of those feedback notes that say, thanks so much for notifying us so that we didn't get attacked. And so it's all about managing that vulnerability surface to drive down the propensity for attacks.
How do you work across these platforms and these three specific to coordinate your hunting operations and teams? How does that kind of play into that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We haven't talked a lot about the hunt teams, but it's one of the truly world-class capabilities that CISA has. And we've been able to build that based on the budget that you've given us and the new authorities that we've gotten since 2021. And essentially, these are experts that can go on working with critical infrastructure, and they go on a network and they can look for and find evidence of intrusions. And that's where we found these Chinese Volt Typhoon actors. And so we've been hunting with our critical infrastructure owners and operators pretty deliberately since the Volt Typhoon threat was discovered. Frankly, as I said, it is the tip of the iceberg, but just in 23, 97 hunting engagements that have allowed us to drive down risk. And what we do is we use those hunting engagements, then we share what we know with our partners, both in industry, but across the federal government. And then we do advisories, which can be used by the IT and security teams so they can get ahead of the threat.
Are you doing that proactively, or you have partners who are coming to you saying, I'm opening up my systems, take a look? I mean, how does that relationship develop?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Typically, we will see that there's some sort of a vulnerability, and we will reach out to that critical infrastructure owner or operator, tell them that we believe there may be intrusions, and then we will work with them to help remediate, to find them and remediate. So we try and be as proactive as possible, because frankly, I think that's the only way we can get ahead of this very complex and dynamic threat environment.
Yeah. Well, and I know my colleague mentioned the hack that happened, or I think maybe you mentioned it with the Commerce Secretary being intruded upon, and I think another agency as well. So obviously that is a huge concern in being proactive to go after those threats. And then I have very little time left, but could you elaborate a little bit on what you're doing? You mentioned, 35% increase in your field force. What are you doing to really work with schools, those water facilities, hospitals, like you mentioned?
Yeah, so one of the great things about being the national coordinators, we're really at the center of working with sector risk management agencies. And at the beginning of 2023, I really wanted to focus on developing that connective tissue with other agencies. So in particular, focus on water facilities with EPA, focus on hospitals with HHS, focus on schools with ED. And so we work together to do probably over 1,000 engagements now across the country, working with these target-rich, cyber-poor entities, frankly, the ones who have been the victim of the scourge of ransomware. And we've really been able to help them improve their security and resilience by putting very basic things in place. These no-cost services that we provide, whether that's vulnerability scanning, whether we're doing assessments for cyber resilience, whether it's advising them on implementing some of the cybersecurity performance goals that we published. And so we've been able to drive down that risk. Ransomware is still in a pretty bad place, but I'll tell you, it would be much, much worse if we didn't use the budget to be able to help shore up some of these target-rich, cyber-poor entities across the country.
Thank you, Director. I yield
Thanks,
back.
ma'am.
Gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, the floor is yours.
Welcome, Director. Good to see you. Thank you for coming and visit me in my office a week before last.
Thank you, sir.
And I appreciate your offer, too, of coming to all of our districts to help with businesses, institutions, learn about their vulnerabilities in cyber. So thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
So I'm the issue of LiDAR has come up today, particularly with cars. My understanding is that Chinese cars aren't allowed to be sold in the United States yet, but they're working on that.
Yes, sir.
But there are lots of other kinds of vulnerabilities, and with the fact that Chinese law requires all of their PRC LiDAR companies, regardless of where they're operating, to provide any available data collected by their products to the CCP. So, I'm extremely concerned that we're potentially giving CCP unprecedented access, not only to data on our U.S. citizens, but also sensitive data in areas of military installations or U.S. infrastructure. Besides cars, there's a lot of uses of this technology, and I believe that almost half of the market is supplied by Chinese companies. So I guess my question surrounds, what do we need to do in order to protect our transportation hubs, our rail yards, our airports, our highways, our city streets, not to mention our utilities and important pieces of, infrastructure, power generation facilities, all that kind of thing, plus our military. And how does CISA leverage its attack surface management platform to reduce risk to all of this critical infrastructure?
Sir.
So any ideas on what we should be proactively doing, or explain to us what we already are doing, what more we should allow you to
Sir,
do?
thank you so much. It was great to meet with you as well, and my team looks forward to spending time in your district.
Good.
On the attack surface management, it is all about reducing exposed vulnerabilities. But to your really good question about how do we deal with all this massive critical infrastructure, it's all underpinned by a technology backbone, frankly. And the part of the problem is we've never demanded of major technology providers that they ensure that they are prioritizing security. The history of technology has been about cool features and speed to market. And what it really needs to be is about putting security first. So one of our major priorities at CISA is to shift the burden from end users and individuals and small businesses across the country to the major technology providers who can really bear it, so that they're building and testing and deploying and delivering technology that is secure by design. I think that's the best thing we can do to catalyze. Require it. Yes, sir. And right now it's not. So CISA is not a regulator. We're not a law enforcement agency, of course. But what we are doing is building those best practices. We use the cybersecurity performance goals to articulate the right standards for cybersecurity for both information technology and operational technology. But at the end of the day, we need some sort of minimum standards. And that's one of the points that was articulated in the NSM this morning.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. This isn't tongue-in-cheek, but have you ever discovered any Chinese-produced technology that is not a cyber risk?
I would have to say no to that. But I could go back and get you a more comprehensive answer. I think just broadly, we have to assume from everything that we are seeing that there is a very serious risk from Chinese cyber actors, and we need to be very mindful of that when we're building and deploying and using technology infrastructure.
Good. Well, again, Director, thank you for being with us. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
sir.
You'll back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris, floor is yours for questions.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the director for being here again this year. Now, last year, I think when I spoke with you last year, I was a little worried about censorship, especially with regards to elections, and it's been kind of a busy year for CISA with regards to the federal courts, I guess. Because last October, in this Washington Post story, it says that the U.S. Circuit Court for the Fifth Circuit, Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, ruled that a key cybersecurity defense agency, which I think they were talking about your agency, probably violated the First Amendment. Do you agree with the court's decision, or do you stand by that? Do you think the court's got it wrong on this?
Thanks for the question, Dr. Harris. I believe the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on this, but let me just be very clear, and I appreciate you asking. CISA does not censor, has never censored, doesn't facilitate censorship, and any claims of that are patently false.
So you think the court got it wrong? All right. Well, we'll see. I guess Supreme Court will have to rule on that. But the three-judge panel, I think it was unanimous, decided that you, in fact, were violating the First Amendment. Now, CISA, my understanding is that, and this is from a June 26th press release, that CISA, but not from you, that CISA moved its censorship operation to a CISA-funded nonprofit after CISA and the Biden administration were sued in federal court. implicitly admitting that its censorship activities are unconstitutional. What are some of these CISA-funded nonprofits?
I have no idea what you're asking about. The allegations against the agency are riddled with factual inaccuracies and do not reflect CISA's non-political mission of protecting our nation's infrastructure. And, frankly, at a time when the U.S. faces unrelenting threats to America, I would hope that CISA's mission would not be undermined by political partisan purposes, sir.
Well, look, I couldn't agree with you more. We are actually under some pretty significant cyber threats, so I don't know why CISA spends its time collaborating with private companies to basically censor Americans. I mean, look, that's what the Fifth Circuit Court said. I know you disagree.
We don't.
Well,
Just to be
again,
clear,
the Fifth Circuit was pretty clear
the
that
Supreme
you do.
Court put a stay
Now,
on the
Director, the Supreme
injunction,
Court has
sir.
not ruled. The highest
Exactly.
federal court opinion, will you agree, was that your agency probably violated the First Amendment. Am I misrepresenting the highest
I
federal
would
court
agree
that's
that
ruled
the
on
highest
this?
court put a stay on the injunction until they rule on it.
And you understand, of course, that stays, and your background's not as a lawyer, mine isn't either, but your understanding is that a stay is not the same as a ruling. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Now,
To be clear, CISA does not censor, has never censored, does not facilitate censorship. I just want to be very,
Sure.
very clear about that.
Sure. Now, CISA defines malinformation as anything, quote, based on fact but used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. Is that correct? Is that, I take it that must be from your website or something you published. Or you can define is that a correct definition of malinformation?
Sure.
So you think that malinformation, so something that's based on fact, should somehow be, and I'll use the term censored. I mean, you think that something based on fact, a government agency should be allowed to comment on whether or not it is used out of context to mislead, harm, and manipulate, because context is actually kind of a subjective decision. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, fact is not subjective. Facts are facts, but context is kind of subjective, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, because I know you mean, to protect the nation, sir. So just to be very clear, CISA's role, because I know you would want us to be doing this. There are foreign adversaries who want to influence, who want to manipulate, who want to interfere with elections.
So excuse me, and I'm going to just interrupt. So you only deal with foreign adversaries when you're talking about election malinformation.
We don't even deal with them. Election officials have asked us to help them with this issue. We do three things. Right. We work with the intelligence community to articulate foreign tactics of manipulation and disinformation. We talk about accurate information on election infrastructure, and we amplify the voices of election officials who are the trusted subject matter experts.
So with regards to the elections, my understanding is that CISA, in fact, in the past has pointed out some potential problems with mail-in voting, but then suggested that posts about problems with mail-in voting might be disinformation or misinformation. Is that true?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm happy to follow up
I'll get
on
you the
that.
details. And finally, I see my time is running out, but I do, following up on the China threats, in agriculture, obviously DJI is a maker of most of the drones. They fly over some pretty sensitive areas that are adjacent to defense facilities, for instance. And I would hope that we're looking carefully as to whether or not we're losing critical information. And I would rather you spend your time on that than election integrity. I yield back.
I do, thank you. And we're working in your district, by the way, and really enjoying it. We do notifications to prevent businesses from being attacked by ransomware. We're working with one of the largest health providers in your district. So it might be useful to talk to some of them. And I'd love to come to your district and do a community roundtable with respect to our mission to support state and local election officials who are on the front lines of defending democracy. At the end of the day, that is $48 million in our $3 billion budget. So you can rest assured that our focus is on the most serious threats to the United States of America. Breat Navy.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, is recognized for questions.
Hello, Director, and good to see you again. Thanks for stopping by the office.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the great combo.
I was going to ask a number of the questions that Dr. Harris has asked, but I will just point out that last year, when you were before this committee, you said to me in my testimony, you said, just to be totally crystal clear, as I think you want me to be, we don't censor anything. We don't flag anything to social media organizations at all. It seemed to me there's been much ado about this, that maybe we were arguing over maybe the definition of what is, but it seems like your testimony today is that CISA has never worked with, coordinated with third-party institutions or groups to have any sort of influence or at all in social media companies.
Yeah,
Is that
it's
your
you, thank
testimony?
you for asking, because it's
Is that your
good for us
testimony?
to be able to talk publicly about this. So on the substance of the issue, just to be very clear, in 2018 and 2020, so before I was the director, actually under the oversight of the last administration, based on asks from state and local election officials, CISA took information from election officials who were worried about foreign activity, saying things like, this election, the election polling place is here, not there, or it's closed. They would take that information and forward it to social media companies, not telling them what to do, not saying to take it down, not encouraging them to do anything other than this is information from a state and local, by the way, of both parties across the country. We passed it to those social media companies, again, before I got here, 2020, and we said, do with it what you will. Now, that happened 200 times. And when I came in, I said, this is really not worth resources to be passing information. And so we stopped the program. But again, that occurred under the oversight in the last administration, and we are not doing it under my leadership.
Why would the Fifth Circuit of Court of Appeals say this? It said CISA was the primary facilitator of the FBI's interactions with social media platforms and worked in close connection with the FBI to push the platforms to change their moderation policies over hack and leak content. Now, hack and leak content was referring specifically to the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, which some have labeled foreign information. So I'm not sure when you're sitting here saying, oh, well, we're dealing with foreign information, that you're not talking about this. It seems like the court had done a lot of due diligence
CISA played
on
no
this.
role, had nothing to do with the Hunter Biden laptop, and the allegations of CISA censoring anything are patently false.
Okay.
The allegations are
We
riddled
have your
with factual
testimony, it's on record,
inaccuracy.
it's under oath.
Wonderful.
We'll
Thank
move on. You're familiar with Executive Order 14019, dealing with elections?
I think that's on voting access, correct?
Yes. Have you presented your report as required by it says within 200 days of the date of this order, the head of each agency shall submit to the Assistant President for Domestic Policy a strategic plan. Have you submitted your strategic plan?
No. And we would be I'll go back and get the specifics, but
Do you think that the executive order is not valid? Is
we
that why?
do election infrastructure security, so we would not have a role in that specifically. And so I'm pretty sure we didn't submit anything on that, but I'm happy to go back and verify that, because election infrastructure security is what we do. We don't do things like voting access,
Okay.
and we don't have
That's good to hear.
expertise
There
in
was a
that
FOIA request.
area either.
There was a FOIA request after this deadline that was not replied to, is my understanding. So that would be good news to hear. We'll double check on that and make sure that's happening. I do want to touch on one topic we talked about, of course, is China. The question I had asked you in the office was whether this was coming from people hacking in overseas or whether it was domestic, and what was your answer?
So what the Chinese cyber actors are using is a series of obfuscated infrastructure to be able to jump into our domestic civilian infrastructure. So it's coming overseas, but going through a series of layered infrastructure and taking advantage of the defects and the flaws and the inherent insecurities in that civilian critical infrastructure.
Okay, yesterday when I asked you about this, you said that I said, are they here or are they overseas hacking in? And you said that they're here, they're taking advantage of like home networks, home routers.
Absolutely.
And the like. So
Yeah,
are they here or are they?
They are hacking from China into U.S. critical infrastructure. When I was talking about the small office, home office routers,
Right.
essentially they are open access points because there's very insecure technology. And so they're jumping from one layer of infrastructure onto these small office, home office routers that are very insecure, and then using them as a launch point into our civilian critical infrastructure. So of course they're coming from China because they're
Well,
Chinese cyber
that's
actors.
specifically the question I asked you
onto
yesterday,
our,
and that's.
yes, you
I got
asked
a
me
different
whether they're
answer to
here, and as I
Are the
said,
people here, or are they overseas? I said, are they overseas
Well, the
hacking into it, or are they here
hackers-
within our institutions?
hackers are coming from China. They are on our civilian critical infrastructure, and it's not like people are on it. It's
I understand that,
Right.
but the question is, are they domestic here inside the institutions working to hack? Are they neighbors? Specifically, the example we talked about was like being close to one of these routers and being able to hack in and
hackers are
overseas.
overseas
Okay,
coming into our civilian infrastructure, which doesn't make it any better, I don't think.
okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to do something fairly unusual now. I'm going to recognize myself for a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
The first, I want to follow up a little bit, and I just want to plant the question. I don't expect you to, but when you talk about election infrastructure, and some of us are familiar with the plan from the United States Postal Service to do their new plan, whatever they call it, blah, 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 which in many instances involves the transportation of those states that have mail-in ballots across state lines in the traditional fashion. I don't know whether that falls into your bailiwick, but I would like you to see what, if any, precautions are being taken to treat mail-in ballots differently than mail in that plan, if there is any provision, or if that falls outside of your jurisdiction, if you could advise who you think's jurisdiction it falls inside. And so that's for another day, but I'd appreciate you guys kind of leaning into that. This morning, the administration released the National Security Memorandum on Critical Infrastructure, Security and Resilience. You've mentioned it in your comments. What new action does this require of CISA on top of what you're already doing as you've kind of described here today? What's that change as a result of that being released today, in your view?
Yes, sir. And to your first point, I will get back to you on that. We do work with the U.S. Postal Service. In particular, we just put out a product about safety of mail handling of ballots because there have been some fentanyl that's been found in local election offices, unfortunately, and we want to make sure that these mail handlers who are dealing with ballots are safe and secure. But I'll get back to you with your specific question.
That'd be great, and thank you for that. But to refine that a little bit, is what you've been working on with them reflected in this new plan?
Yes, sir.
Fentanyl or otherwise, since I don't think ballots are just, hey, regular yeehaw vanilla mail.
Yes, sir. I will get back to you on that, Chairman.
Thank you.
On the NSM in particular, so what I think is really notable about this is the last time a presidential policy directive on critical infrastructure was published was in 2013, before CISA was even thought of. And the threat environment was very different. It was about terrorism. Now we're looking at physical threats, but also cyber threats. And the threat landscape is very different. So what this National Security Memorandum does, most importantly, is to recognize now we're in a world of high dependencies, high digitization, high vulnerabilities, and you can't just manage by sector. And this was very glaringly obvious to me in my last job where I was at Morgan Stanley as the head of resilience. We could spend billions of dollars to shore up our infrastructure, but we were dependent on power and water and communications. And so really it's all about how you manage cross-sector risk. And so CISA's role as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience, working with industry, working with sector risk management agencies to drive down risk through the delivery of no-cost voluntary services, training, assessment, exercises, and information and technical data is really important to being able to protect the United States of America from the myriad of threat actors, China preeminently, but also Russia and Iran and North Korea and the cyber criminals who are wreaking havoc on our hospitals and our schools and our water facilities. So I welcome the opportunity to put this into place in the coming year. And it's one of the reasons why we have asked for an increase in our budget so that we can effectively manage this cross-sector risk from a variety of very serious threats, sir.
Thank you. And just one more follow-up. A couple of weeks ago, or whatever it was, there was a hack into a healthcare clearing network, or, don't laugh at me.
Change healthcare. Yep.
Yep. When you are basically, when we're looking at the budget, if you could identify, just a follow-up, here's the stuff, since it's obviously infrastructure, the healthcare, what we learned from that, blah, 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 and without telling any secrets, but basically kind of say, this is part of the increase, if it is in fact the case,
Yeah.
in terms of trying to check that healthcare box to make sure that we're paying appropriate attention as a result of what happened there, which I think was
Yeah.
illegal, but your information's probably better.
Yeah, I would be happy to get back to you. It was a ransomware attack on Change Healthcare, significant cascading impacts across the nation. And we've been working very closely with HHS to ensure that we can help a lot of these infrastructure providers in the healthcare world, to include, the lesser resource ones like rural hospitals, that they have the resources they need to be able to drive down risk. And we need to do more of that, as you said. So thank you for the opportunity to drill down in that with the committee.
Yes, ma'am. And members, if you have further questions, please get them submitted expeditiously to the director so that we can ask her to expeditiously respond to those in the timeline. Thank you, Madam Director, for your appearance today and your preparedness. And we're going to go ahead and adjourn the subcommittee.
Thanks, Chairman. Thank you, member.